Let's now turn to Shakespeare in Love, and let's address the elephant in the room. It's a movie. This is a dramatic festival bar on the beach. Shakespeare in Love is a movie. Yes, it has half of William Shakespeare's name in the title, but so does Free Willy. Now, a question for you. By show of hands, how many people have seen the movie Shakespeare in Love? My work here is done. I've seen this thing. Okay, well, let's do a little, I am going to give a synopsis of the storyline as is in the play as opposed to the movie, because there are some differences that I will talk about. But first, let's talk about how in the world the movie ended up being presented at Bard on the Beach. So, in the late 1980s, we're going way back in time, a novelist, screenwriter by the name of Mark Norman was given an idea by his son. His son suggested, why don't you write a movie about Shakespeare? So Mark Norman sat down and wrote the first sort of draft of Shakespeare in Love. And it was optioned by a production house, and a director by the name of Robert Zwick was attached to it. Robert Zwick liked it, but said, we could punch this up. So he hired Tom Stoppard. Tom Stoppard, the Czech-born British playwright, perhaps one of the most important British playwrights of the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century. He's still very active. He did a rewrite of this screenplay. Now, he was the perfect guy to hire. His first play, his first major play, was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, first staged in 1967 and performed once at Bard on the Beach, which is a play based on Hamlet. So Tom Stoppard knows his Shakespeare. Tom Stoppard is also famous for his wit, his wordplay, and his sense of sort of intellectual fun in his plays. So he took Mark Norman's idea, they reworked it, and they came up with sort of the final script of Shakespeare in Love. Now they needed a star to get this project made, and the star they got for Shakespeare in Love was Julia Roberts. She was the original person to play Viola de Lesseps. But Julia Roberts said she'd only do it if Shakespeare was played by Daniel Day-Lewis. And Lewis said no. So the screenplay languished for some years, as often happens. Eventually, it was picked up by a different director, John Madden. And he cast two less-known actors in the lead roles. For Viola de Lesseps, we got Gwyneth Paltrow. This was her breakout role. This is the role that made her a star, and she's taken that stardom and used it to now sell cosmetics made out of free-range avocados. She's got some strange business. And as Shakespeare, they cast Joseph Fiennes. Now, I have nothing against Joseph Fiennes. I think he did a wonderful job in the movie. But picture Joseph Fiennes. He looks a little bit like the artist formerly known as Prince. Think about Shakespeare, what he looks like. Balding, middle-aged man with that embarrassing earring. Looks more like Paul Giamatti than Joseph Fiennes. So we got these two pretty people, put them in this movie, it gets made, and it wins 7 Academy Awards in 1999. It's huge. Now, jump ahead some 10 years or so, a man called Lee Hall, who is not a playwright, he's a screenwriter, takes this screenplay and turns it into a play. Lee Hall is famous for writing the screenplays Billy Elliot, and if you go to the theater tonight, you can see Rocket Man, this biopic about Elton John, written by Lee Hall. So we have a screenwriter writes a play based on a screenplay, one of the writers of whom was the playwright. Stoppard. So it gets done, it's huge. It opens in London's West End back in 2014, I think it was. Then it plays Stratford upon Ontario, and it's played all around the place. I recently read an article that said right now it is the most performed non-Shakespearean play being staged in North America. This play is being staged all over the place. How is it different from the screenplay? Well, I'm going to tell you the story in a few minutes, and you'll see some differences because you're all familiar with the movie. But in general, I'd say it's about 30% longer. That is, it's 30% more dialogue than there is in the movie. Certain roles have been expanded, especially the role of Christopher Marlowe and John Webster. A subplot about Shakespeare's first girlfriend, Rosaline, is entirely cut. That hapless Puritan preacher who was standing in the streets outside the theater saying a plague on both your houses, he's cut. And there's more focus on Shakespeare's writer's block in the play than there is in the movie. But this whole idea of taking a movie and making it into a play, it seems a bit odd, doesn't it? But I've looked at a little research, and if you go back, here's a wonderful example of this sort of cross-pollination between these different media. In 1945, Christopher Isherwood published a book called Berlin Stories. Berlin Stories. It was made into a movie in the 1950s called I Am a Camera. The movie was made into a musical play in the 1960s called Cabaret. In the 70s, that musical play was made into a movie by Bob Fosse called Cabaret. So, book, movie, play, movie. This sort of thing does happen. And if you go to London or you go to New York's West End, you will see half a dozen plays based on movies, and they are all by Disney. The Lion King has been running something like 15, 20 years in London and in New York. And in a way, this should remind us of Shakespeare's own practice, because Shakespeare did not write original material. Shakespeare adapted. Shakespeare adapted Romeo and Juliet from a long poem called Romeus and Juliet. He adapted his history plays from Plutarch and the classical historian, and from Hall's Chronicle, English history. He adapted from Italian novellas. These stories were taken in different poetry, history, novels, and turned into plays. So, let's talk about the storyline of Shakespeare in Love, the play. It's a little bit complicated. So, it begins in 1593. That's an important year. Hold on to that thought. 1593. Young Will Shakespeare in London, starving artist. He owes plays to two different theatrical producers. One of them is Philip Henslowe. Philip Henslowe owns the Rose Theatre on the South Bank of London, in Southwark. The other is Richard Burbage. Richard Burbage owns the Curtain Theatre, which is in Shoreditch, London. Shoreditch, London is sort of just the northeast of central London, a very trendy part of London these days. He's promised them a new rollicking comedy, Romeo and Ethel the Pirate's Daughter, which is not only a great title, but they're selling t-shirts with that on it here. I may have to buy one. But he has complete writer's block. He can't get on anything. And the play begins with him struggling to write the first line of a sonnet, and he can't get it out. His friend, Christopher Marlowe, also a playwright and poet, helps him, but it's still a problem. Henslowe doesn't care. Henslowe has money problems. He owes money to a ruthless loan shark named Fennyman, and he has to put on a play to raise funds. So he starts auditioning actors for a play that has not been written yet. And most of these actors are terrible. But there's one very good one by the name of Thomas Kent. And Shakespeare's amazed by this young man. He's great. Not only is he great, when he auditions with Shakespeare. Right? He quotes him great. He doesn't know that Thomas Kent is a young lady by the name of Viola de Lesseps, who loves theater wants to be an actor but has to disguise himself as a man because women aren't allowed on the stage in this period. So the audition goes great. Shakespeare tries to question him, her, he, her, runs away, worried she's going to be exposed. Shakespeare, with Christopher Marlowe in tow, goes to her house, the house of the De Lesseps, where there's a party going on. And the party is because, unbeknownst to her, Viola, her father is going to wed her to a nobleman. The nobleman is Lord Wessex. Lord Wessex is an aristocrat, titled family for generations, but has no money. The Lesseps don't have a title, but they have money. So, money for title, title for money. Viola doesn't know this yet. Shakespeare shows up at this party, sees this woman, doesn't know it's Thomas Kent, it's a beautiful woman, says, oh my God, and dances with her. And while he's dancing with her, she recognizes him, William Shakespeare, my favorite poet. Right? So, sparks begin to fly. But Wessex says, oh, there's an intruder here, grabs this guy, kicks him out, and says, what's your name? And Shakespeare, charming guy, says, Christopher Marlowe, and hightails him. As he's leaving the party, he and Christopher Marlowe see Juliet up on the balcony. Viola up on the balcony. And Viola says, oh, is it William Shakespeare, Viola? And Viola says, make me a poem. Now. Okay, so this is imagine the pressure, male performance anxiety, at a literary level, and he's got writer's block, so he's like, Marlowe starts feeding him lines, right? And it's going well, feeding lines, and suddenly it clicks. He's found his muse. He's able to complete the poem. He's broken through his writer's block. Exciting. Rushes back to the theater, starts writing the play, which will eventually become Romeo and Juliet, starring this brilliant young actor, Thomas Kent, as Romeo. And after a little while, Juliet, Romeo, blah, blah, blah. Shakespeare discovers that Thomas Kent is Viola, right? And they have an affair. They begin a sexual affair. Not a brilliant idea because she has to marry the Lord Wessex. Indeed, the Lord Wessex takes her to meet the Queen of England to get the marriage approved. And the Queen does approve it. At the same time, Shakespeare, who sees this whole scene unfold because he's in disguise, arranges so a wager is made. Wessex, who hates poetry, hates theater, doesn't think anything of this stuff, argues that no writer will ever capture the true nature of love. I wager 50 pounds. And the Queen says, okay, I will be the judge of that wager. So, things are progressing. They have their Romeo. Ned Allen, the most famous actor of the era, is going to play Mercutio. Everything is fine until Richard Burbage shows up and says, where's my play? There's a huge fight, and he steals a manuscript which he believes to be the new play, Romeo and Ethel, the Pirate's Daughter, and runs away with it. But it isn't, because there's a young boy who's hanging around the theater by the name of John Webster, and he slips Burbage the wrong manuscript. He slips him a play called Grammar Girton's Needle. This is a real play. Don't read it. All the people there celebrate. We tricked Burbage. We did. Let's go get drunk. So they all go. Viola's still dressed as Thomas Kent. Only Shakespeare knows he's a woman. And they go. They start drinking, and it comes out that Shakespeare is married. And Viola / Thomas Kent is devastated, runs off. Shakespeare's about to follow when the news comes that Christopher Marlowe is dead. Christopher Marlowe, his friend, has been stabbed to death. Dagger went in his eye, into his brain, in a brawl. Shakespeare goes to Viola. They make up. She confesses her love for him, but says, I still have to get married. Sad. They try to go on with the play, but John Webster, that little annoying boy, exposes Viola as a woman, so the play is shut down, the Rose Theatre is closed, the play can't go on. Unexpectedly, Burbage shows up and says, well, you can use my theater, the Curtain, to put on your play. So they say, okay, we're going to do that, but now we don't have anyone to play Romeo because Thomas Kent's a woman. So Shakespeare takes on the role of Romeo. The day the play opens, the young lady, Viola, gets married. As soon as the marriage ceremony, unhappy, is over, she rushes to the theater to see this play and finds it in a state of utter chaos backstage. Because the boy actor supposed to play Juliet, his voice is just broken. He sounds like the Cookie Monster. They can't put him on stage, so they take Viola and push her on stage, even though she's a woman. So now we have Shakespeare playing the role of Romeo and Viola playing the role of Juliet. They perform Romeo and Juliet for the first time, and it is a massive, massive success. As soon as the play is over, Master Tilney, who is the person who licenses theaters, shows up and says, you're all going to jail. You put a woman on stage. You can't do that. That's against the law. By strange coincidence, Queen Elizabeth I is in the audience. We're going to suspend our disbelief there for a minute. But she comes forward and she supports the lie that Viola is actually a boy playing a woman, so that they get off. She turns to Shakespeare and says, great play, next time something a little cheerier for Twelfth Night. And she turns to Wessex and says, Wessex, you lost your bet, because we finally have a play, a poem, a piece of literature that proves, illustrates the nature of true love. You owe 50 pounds, which coincidentally is just what Shakespeare needs to set him up in a theatrical troupe, 50 pounds. The play ends with Viola going off with Wessex to his plantations in North America, and we find William Shakespeare back at his writing desk trying to compose something, this time accompanied by the ghost of Christopher Marlowe. And that's how the play ends. So you can see quite a few differences from the movie version, especially with the role of Marlowe in there. So, I said when I began this lecture series that I thought all of the plays this season dealt with the question of identity and who we are, how we define ourselves. And I think this play does too, in two different ways. First of all, it deals with this big question of the identity of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is so famous, and yet we have no firm conception of the man. Now, some people say, that's because it's a conspiracy, right? It's so mysterious. You start looking into the Shakespeare. We don't know anything about him. This is not true. We know as much about him as we do most of the playwrights of his age. And some playwrights we don't know a thing about, but we want more. And it is not a conspiracy that has hidden that stuff from us. It's the nature of Shakespeare's life. When he died in 1616, his plays, still popular, slowly were replaced by new plays. Theatrical fashions changed. New actors came along. Of course they did. By 1642, or in 1642, the beginning of the British Civil War, all the theaters in England are shut down. And they're shut down until 1660. So imagine in 1650, and I don't know, say you inherit Shakespeare's house. He's got all these papers, he's got these manuscripts, he's got these letters, he's got this diary, right? Who's this William guy? Oh, he was a writer 40 years ago. No one's seen his plays in 30 years. Chuck. Why would you keep that stuff? So it was discarded, it crumbled, it fell apart. When the theaters were reopened in 1660, virtually no one who would have known Shakespeare was alive, except for one daughter, and she died, I think it was 1661. So there's this gap here. Shakespeare had to be rediscovered. And because of that gap, we've lost so much that we wish we've had. And so we've rushed to fill in that space. One of the ways we've rushed in is with conspiracies. Beginning in the 19th century, it must have been someone else. It must have been Christopher Marlowe who wrote the plays. It must have been the Earl of Oxford. It must have been Queen Elizabeth I. It was Elvis Presley. I don't know. Series of theories. to fill in because we want a big character behind those plays. The idea that he's just this incredibly hard-working, financially savvy guy from the country, it's not glamorous enough for us. So we invented things. This play invents a story for us. Romeo and Juliet is a reflection of his life, and it's very romantic, but there's a problem here. The conspiracy theorists, the people who say Shakespeare was Oxford, the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere's, their argument is this: all artists write about their own lives. That is profoundly stupid. Profoundly stupid. And we can think of a million cases. What, Mario Puzo was in the mafia? No. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But they say, no. If you look at Shakespeare, he's got a story about a king with 3 daughters. The Earl of Oxford had 3 daughters. Hamlet was attacked by a pirate ship. The Earl of Oxford was attacked by a pirate ship, right? So therefore, no, right? Of course not. These stories were from other places. But what Shakespeare in Love does is actually sort of follows that model. Oh, he wrote Romeo and Juliet about this broken love and has a balcony scene because he was the balcony and she, So it sort of feeds into that idea that art is generated by the artist's life, where, as I told you, Shakespeare got the story from a pre-existing poem. So, the identity of William Shakespeare is behind this. How we want to imagine this person, how we want to imagine our artists. The other sort of question about identity has to do with how we define ourselves through literature, through the stories that circulate in our culture. Viola D'Alessa, she wants to live in a love poem or a romantic play. She's told that all the men from court were looking at her, and she says, all the men at court are without poetry. If they look at me, all they see is my father's fortune. I will have poetry in my life, and adventure, and love above all, unbiddable, ungovernable, like a riot in the heart, and nothing to be done, come ruin or rapture, tragedy or comedy. So later, when she tells her nurse that she's Thomas Kent, that she's doing this acting stuff, the nurse says, my lady, this play will end badly. That is, what you're doing, this little adventure, will end badly. Viola says, 'tis a comedy. It ends with a pirate jig. It'll be fine. So, imagining herself in this sort of romantic comedy, her life based on, I don't know, the equivalent would be basing your life on When Harry Met Sally or something. And Shakespeare, of course, tries to write a comedy, but ends up writing a tragedy. At the end of the play, it's Queen Elizabeth who has the most sensible response to this way of thinking. The Lord Wessex says, how is this going to end, all this mess that we're in? And the Queen says, as stories must when love's denied, with tears and a journey. It is not going to end well. I don't care if you identify yourself as a romantic hero, this is going to end sadly. Now, so 2 identity questions. The problem I think the writers faced with this play, a couple of them. The first one is movies, plays, books about writers are boring. The reason for that is that writing is boring. Imagine, take the biggest director, take Steven Spielberg, give him 3D IMAX cameras, tell him you're going to make a movie about the artistic process of this novelist, the most exciting novelist in the world. That movie is 8 hours of seeing a guy sitting at a keyboard going, and occasionally the big action sequences are writing is dull. I know, I do it. It's so dull. I don't know about you, but I've had to put a program on my computer that won't allow me to access the internet for set periods of time. Right? So it's called freedom. What they do, which is very clever, of course, is they focus on not so much the writing process, but on the rehearsal process. And one of the things I really like about the movie and the play is that it catches the communal aspect of theater. In Shakespeare's time, the theaters that were ran, the professional theaters in London, were averaging 18 plays a year. 18 plays a year. That means plays had to be written quickly, they had to be rehearsed quickly, performed for very short runs, and then quickly forgotten. And the only way you could do that was by hack work and very often getting a bunch of writers together in a room. So you can imagine someone like Philip Henslow saying, oh, I heard about this grisly murder in Wales. Great idea for a play. Get Marlowe, he does blood. Get Shakespeare, he can do the comic subplot. Get Chapman, he can do some classical references. And plays were very often cobbled together. And one of the things that Shakespeare critics have really come to realize over the past 20 years or so is just how much Shakespeare collaborated, how much of that sort of work he did, including with, and this is a relatively recent discovery, Christopher Marlowe. Computer analysis has shown that Marlowe helped him write the Henry VI plays. So it's more like movie production. Mark Norman, oh, it's good, let's get Tom Stoppard. Hey, let's get Lee Hall, boom. That's how plays were assembled in this period. It wasn't a public in a garret turning out the perfect thing. And if you've ever been involved in theatrical production, you know how much things get changed between the first read-through and the dress rehearsal. The other things that I like about this is it demonstrates the flexibility of the text. Shakespeare goes into this project to write Romeo and Ethel the Pirate's Daughter, a rollicking comedy with a bit about a dog, and he ends up with this tragedy, right? Things get rewritten. And we know now this is exactly what happened in Shakespeare's time, and we know it from his own works. Hamlet exists in 3 different versions. I keep bugging Christopher Gaze to stage Hamlet Quarto 1, the Hamlet you've never seen. King Lear exists in 2 very different versions, very different. And for centuries, what the critics said, well, Shakespeare, the brilliant, could only have written one perfect play, so let's take the 2 Lears and push them together. And that's what you read in high school. But now we realize, no, it's the world of theater. An actor quit. Oh, I gotta rewrite this. We're going on tour, we don't have as many people. We better rewrite that scene. The politics of the moment have changed. We can't say that about the French. Right? Things change, scripts evolve, and I think this play does a good example of showing that. Now, the other thing that's so fun about this play is the combination of the imaginary and the real. The imaginary stuff, Viola de Lesseps, Lord Wessex, Fenimond, the loan shark who becomes feeder-struck as the play goes ahead. The relationship between Romeo and Juliet and Twelfth Night, there were many years between those plays. He didn't go from Romeo and Juliet to Twelfth Night. The idea that Queen Elizabeth would come to the public theater, no, the theater came to Queen Elizabeth. So that's wrong. There's some things in this play and the movie which might be true. What we see a lot, and you'll really notice it in the play, much more in the movie, is that characters say things, and Shakespeare goes, oh, that could be a line in a play, and it will be. Last week, someone asked me about Shakespeare's use of the Bible, biblical language. Was he citing the Bible? I said, well, maybe, but also biblical language circulated in ways it doesn't now. It could be stuff he overheard or didn't even think about and got worked into his plays. So that's maybe true. And then there's really true historical stuff. Some of these characters, for example, Christopher Marlowe, one of my heroes, personal heroes, born 1564, same year as Shakespeare, Canterbury, goes to university, gets an MA, probably is a spy for the Elizabethan government, spying on Catholics over in France. He writes the first major blockbuster plays of the Elizabethan theater, Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, the Jew of Malta. Tamburlaine, some of you who were here last year remember I said, if Tamburlaine is ever performed, I will fly across the world to see it. I did it in August. It was performed at the Royal Shakespeare Company. I flew all the way to England to see a single play. Most self-indulgent thing I've ever done in my life. Expensive, too. Airfare, ticket, accommodation, divorce proceedings. It adds up. And he died in 1593, the year this play is set. I'll just tell you because it's so wild and interesting. There was a lot of prejudice against immigrants in London. And someone wrote a poem called The Dutch Libel, a poem telling the Dutch people, Dutch immigrants, to get out of town or else we're going to kill you. And they pinned it to a church, and it was signed Tamburlaine, the name of Marlowe's character. So the authorities arrested Marlowe. Marlowe did not write this, but 3 days later he's dead. He dies in a tavern run by a woman called Madame Bull at Deptford. It was said to be an argument over the reckoning, that is the bill. His own dagger plunged into his eye. And the interesting thing is, the 3 men who were in the room with him all had ties to the Elizabethan Secret Service. So Marlowe moved in this interesting, weird world. After his death, his apartment that he used to share with Thomas Kidd was searched, and they found materials that were purportedly blasphemous. And Tom Kidd was tortured, and he wrote about all the nasty things and blasphemous things that Marlowe said. We still have a copy of that. You can look it up. One of the things he was reported to have said is, "They who love not tobacco and boys are fools." Ew. So, he's a real character. That little boy, John Webster, who's in the play, who really likes gory stuff. He's always talking about blood and violence. He would grow up to be John Webster, the playwright, famous for The White Devil and The Duchess of Malfi. Gory, dark plays, wonderful. If you ever get a chance to see The Duchess of Malfi, do so. It's riveting. Philip Henslowe, the theater producer, a realistic guy, and I think he's basically the Elizabethan Christopher Gaze. His impresario, big personality, attracts people to him. And Henslowe, besides running a theater, was a landlord, was a pawnbroker, traded in goat skins. Christopher loves goat skins, right, Mary? All about the goat skins. And lived in Southwark, was landlord, built the Rose Theatre, and he left behind one of the most important documents we have about early theatre. It's called Henslowe's Diary. And it's this sort of ledger book of payments in and out, of loans, of box office receipts. And it's fascinating to look through how much they paid for a costume, a fortune sometimes, how little he wanted to pay playwrights, and being very, very significant. Other things that are real people. Ned Allen, the actor who plays Mercutio, he was a real actor. He was the character played by Ben Affleck in the movie version. He was a star in most of Marlowe's early plays. The other actor, Richard Burbage, who Shakespeare became affiliated with professionally, he would go to star in most of Shakespeare's major plays. He's probably the first actor to have played Hamlet. Edward Tilney, the master of the revels. He was a courtier vaguely related to Queen Elizabeth I, and he was responsible for censorship. You couldn't put a play on in London unless he signed off on it. He would read it to make sure there was nothing that would cause offense. Now, sex, no problem. Violence, no problem. Racism, yeah, well, it depends who it's against. Yeah, fine. But you don't want to give affront to noblemen, and you don't want to stir up religious sensibilities. So those are the sort of things that could get censored. And Tilney personally licensed 30 of Shakespeare's plays. Queen Elizabeth I, obviously a real character, as I mentioned, she didn't go to plays, plays came to her. So those are all real things. And the Rose Theatre is a place, and the Curtain Theatre is a real place. There are also some anachronisms that are worked into the play. Things that are real but in the wrong time. Wessex says that he's going to go off to his, let's get his words here. He's going to go off to his plantations in Virginia, the tobacco weed. I need 4,000 pounds to fit out a ship and put my investments to work. I fancy tobacco has a future. Yeah, it's 1593. There were no tobacco plantations run by Englishmen for another 14 years or so. But here's another glaring error in the movie, in the play, in this production you're going to see. The balcony scene. We see it inspired Shakespeare talking to Viola and ends up with Romeo and Juliet. The most famous scene in Romeo and Juliet, the balcony scene. Here's the problem. There's no balcony in Shakespeare's play. The word is never used. It couldn't be. It didn't exist in English. The word balcony doesn't appear in English until the early 17th century, when tourists come back from Italy and say, the Italians have these weird things. They got these like ledges on the outside of their houses. And people stand there and show themselves off. They call them balcone. Shakespeare never saw a balcony on the outside of a house in his life. And Romeo does not say, what does Romeo say? What light through yonder window breaks? He doesn't say, who's on the balcony? There's no balcony scene. It's a window scene. Okay? So Tom Stoppard, gotcha. So what this play does, what the movie did, I think the play does perhaps even better, because it's a play about theater, and to see it in a theater creates a sort of wonderful sort of meta-dynamics. This play, this story, combines the real and the imagined. It combines historical identity, real historical identity, with literary fabrication, just the way Shakespeare did in his plays. And it's a play about life in the theater, but also people trying to base life on theater, and people basing theater on their lives. And I think the most important line in the whole play is one that Philip Henslow repeats several times. Several times, people say, how are we going to resolve this problem? How are we going to get this play on stage? Everything's going wrong. He says, it'll be fine. I don't know how it'll happen. It's a mystery. He says that several times. Well, I think when it comes to the identity of Shakespeare, where did this genius of artistic production come from? It's a mystery. Thank you. So I left 10 minutes for questions, and Mary is going to come with the microphone, because again, this is being videotaped. If you don't talk into the microphone, the audience is watching the YouTube video won't know what was said. So just raise your hand, and Mary will sprint over to you.
Nice easy one.
Oh, okay, start close.
Thank you. On the subject of making films
Yes.
out of plays,
Yeah.
could you comment on Franco Zeffirelli's Taming of the Shrew with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor?
Could I comment on it? Not intelligently, because I have not seen that film in 20 or 30 years. So I have a very vague memory of it. But it was certainly interesting that they, in some ways, it's sort of a publicity stunt. You took what was Hollywood's premier couple, and a couple that had stormy relationships on and off, and you put them in that play. So it's sort of, working with the Hollywood infamy of that time. But as for the actual sort of value of that film as a Shakespeare adaptation, I'm going to have to pass, because I would have to see it again. My memory is not going back to the 70s? Yeah, sorry. Someone up here.
Hello, thank you for that wonderful talk. Speaking about how we want to see our lives represented in theater and this back and forth, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on or suspicions about Shakespeare's heterosexuality and how that is not represented in Shakespeare in Love. What do you think of that?
The question of Shakespeare's sexuality is a complicated one. It's complicated mainly by the sonnet sequence. So in the sonnet sequence, you have a number of sonnets, not all of them, which are addressed to a young man. And the word love is used again and again. Now, the use of love between same-sex people happens all the time in Shakespeare. You see characters, male, female, saying, "I owe you my love, I love you." So it's a little bit more casual. But some of those poems, it gets a bit more complicated. On the other hand, if you look at those poems, very often what he's saying is to the young man is, "You should get married and have kids." Okay? And I think, is it Sonnet 18? Is it Sonnet 18, Master Mistress of My Heart, Mary?
I never know the numbers.
I
just know the words.
Master Mistress of My Heart, that sonnet where he specifically talks about how gorgeous you are, young man. You're so gorgeous, you should have been a girl, right? But when nature, Mother Nature was making you, right, she fell in love with you. You were so pretty, so she added something to you to make you a man, right? And then he concludes it by saying, well, see, Mother Nature pricked you out for a woman's pleasure, okay? You can love me, but you love, in the other sense, them. So there's that. It's ambiguous. The other thing we have to think about is how sexuality is defined. I've talked about this in previous lectures. We think of sexuality as essence, as interiority. I am something. I am gay. I am straight. I am bisexual. I have 3.14 partners. Whatever. Where in Shakespeare's time, sexuality was defined by what you did, by your acts. You could feel anything, but you didn't do certain things. You could love another man, but if you did certain acts, then you were a sodomite, and that was punishable with grave, punishments, right? So they thought about sexuality differently. In some ways, they were more emotionally fluid than we allow ourselves to be. Although with young polyamorous people, maybe that's changing. I don't understand it. Okay, so it's a very complicated subject. Yes.
Thank you very much again for your talks over the years. I think we've been here for about 10 years, so
wow, thank you so much.
It's been amazing. I just had a question, being a historian, about the part of the play where Viola sneaks onto the stage and is an actress. I just wanted to know.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. Viola's what?
Viola sneaks onto the stage as an actress, and
yes.
I just wanted to know if there's evidence of this happening at the time, and if other women did also try to sneak on the stage.
No, there's no evidence of that happening. It was very strictly controlled. The basic thought was this: any woman who would display herself for money is essentially a prostitute. Right? And there were complicated rules about cross-dressing. Right? For example, women dressing as men or men dressing as women off the stage was a problem. In some countries, for example, in Spain, this sort of worry about cross-dressing even extended to performance. So you have young boys dressed as women. The Spanish authorities thought, well, that's not good. Okay, they can only dress from the top up as women. That didn't work, so they reversed it. Okay, from the bottom down as women. Okay. Trying to find that right balance. But there's no record of that. When the theaters reopened after the Restoration in 1660, then women are suddenly allowed on stage. And for quite a while, they're immediately associated with prostitution, just for the fact that they are displaying themselves in public. So during Shakespeare's time. I don't know, 2 or 3 more minutes. Yep, way over there.
This is I'm sort of interested because you dangled it out there. How does the earlier version of Hamlet differ from the later versions of Hamlet?
It's much shorter. It whips along. There is a scene which isn't in the Hamlet you know between Horatio and Gertrude. And the to be or not to be speech is different. Yeah, Mary, do you remember how it goes?
To be or not to be, aye, there's the point.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there's the point. Okay? So yeah, it's much different. But the thing, if you read it without thinking about the classic Hamlet that you grew up with, I think it reads really well as a nice, snappy version of Hamlet. And that's why I would love to see it staged. So it's a more portable Hamlet, if you will. Because if you do classic like folio Hamlet, you do it at breakneck speed. You're talking 4.5 hours if you do every line, right? But Hamlet Q1, the early Hamlet, you can do that maybe in 2.5 hours. Time for maybe one more question, 1 or 2 more questions. Oh, wait down.
In the movie Shakespeare in Love,
Yeah.
there are a lot of jokes about, I'm thinking in particular of when they move the play to a new place and it's presented by so-and-so with the participation of, and the assistance of, the playbill outside.
Yeah.
Are there similar things in the play?
In the play, yes. The playbill for the production of Romeo and Juliet is read aloud, right? And of course, the Mr. Fennyman, who's the loan shark who wants to get money out of this, becomes smitten with theater as the rehearsal process, and then he's given a role as the apothecary. And since he's the money behind the play, he gets to put his name all over the playbill, right? Which is the joy of being a producer, right? So yes, you do get that very, very nice piece of business in the play version. So it's 5:02, we're gonna have to stop there, but give me a few minutes, I'm happy to talk to people outside in the village. And thank you for coming, enjoy the play.